It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. The presentation that I'm giving today is based on a study that I'm doing of the Ganar program. And Ganar in Spanish means to win or to earn. It's a program that's sponsored by an organization called Partners for the Americas. And I thought I would start actually with a short promotional video that Partners of the Americas created to launch a Kickstarter campaign to fund the intervention. So I'm just going to start with this. Oh, sorry.
Aqui não é fácil ter um futuro. Por isso, gostaríamos de agradecer-lhe por ter transformado a vida de muitas pessoas.
Casi todos mis amigos venden drogas en las calles. Si no fuera por él, hubiera terminado en las mismas.
Mire, yo creo que trajo esperanza. A mí, por ejemplo, me convenció para darles un empleo a muchos chicos, retirarlos de las calles para que no acaben en la delincuencia.
Sim, estou muito feliz por ter voltado à escola. Antes eu ficava em casa o dia todo, fazendo nada. Não queria falar com a minha mãe, não queria estudar. Mas agora, bem melhor.
Sí, es algo más o menos así. Algo así.
Me deu uma autoconfiança e eu nunca pensei que eu fosse trabalhar numa empresa como essa.
Claro que hay un antes y un después de que esto apareciera. Ellos eran chicos sin opciones y ahora ellos tienen herramientas suficientes para enfrentar una vida digna.
Gracias a él aprendí trabajo en equipo, respeto, puntualidad.
Ya no sabíamos qué hacer para que regresara a sus estudios y mira, la solución era fácil.
Es increíble, ¿verdad?, que algo tan sencillo tenga el poder de cambiar tantas vidas. Un simple balón.
One day, it occurred to us that we could use sports to bring in boys and girls from the street. Because on the playing field, it's easier to learn words like effort, discipline, and teamwork. Ideas that help them find work or decide that school is not such a bad place. Yes, a simple ball has changed the lives of thousands of boys and girls. And now we need your help to reach many more. Join our team because, after all, who doesn't like a ball?
Okay, so Ganar is a sports-based life and job skills training program. It operates in a number of countries in the region, including Brazil, which is why you saw that parts of the filming for the video were in Brazil and in Portuguese. And the mission of Ganar is to use the power of sport to help youth develop the skills that they need to be successful in the labor market and in life. And the assumption is that the same skills that youth learn on the sports field can be applied in terms of their employment and their labor skills. And so the Ganar Alliance, there are currently 16 countries, but when Ganar started in 2005, there were just 3, Brazil, Ecuador, and Uruguay. And now we see that it's in 16 countries of the region, primarily funded by USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, and then also by a particular investment fund of the Inter-American Development Bank. So it has quite a large geographical spread in the region. This is the basic organization of the program. So it starts, they describe it as having 4 different phases. The first is a 3-month program where students meet with a facilitator They study in a classroom, but throughout these classroom activities, the metaphor of sports is woven through the curriculum. So that's why they call it this sports-based employability training. This is where we see these core skills that are thought of as both the skills for sports and the skills that you need in the labor market of communication, teamwork, discipline, respect, focus on results, and continual self-improvement. Those are the skills that the curriculum is trying to build and emphasize through a workbook and then through these interactive games. The second phase of the program is a technical training. So depending on the students' interests and the availability of different training options, the students who range in age from 16 to 24, that's the target age range that they're working on, will participate in anything from a course on baking and how to create pastries to IT training. Some do more technical, like welding. The range of technical training opportunities is pretty wide. And then the third phase is a practical experience, so they have an internship. And then finally, they have a follow-on or continued contact with the organization that's sponsoring the program locally to try to provide some follow-up. And throughout this, there's an opportunity for mentors, so individuals in the community who would like to serve as mentors for these youth become involved, and then they also have opportunities to provide community service. So that's essentially the basic model of Ganar. And so as I said, the target participants in the program, Ganar actually selects youth. So when Ganar goes to a new country, to a new site, they do a lot of publicity that they're going to be opening courses, and then they have youth apply because they want to make sure they're getting youth that are very motivated. They consider that they're working with at-risk youth. They make it very clear that they do not see themselves as a gang recovery type of program, so they want to reach youth who are not involved in dangerous or criminal activities, in part because they don't want to create risks to other participants, but they still say that they're working with quote-unquote at-risk youth in ages 16 to 24 who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. The idea is that they also want them to have open minds to participate in sports-based activities, but they don't have to have any particular athletic talents. And then finally, that they have some potential to become positive leaders in their community. So that's who they're looking for in terms of who they target. So why is USAID investing in this program in Ganar? Why is it? Why do they think of it as a strategic intervention? And in particular, the funds for this are coming from two main sources. One is from their education program, and the other is from CARCI, which is the Central American Regional Crime Initiative. So in terms of education, USAID has three main strategies for education. The first is to improve reading skills for children in primary grades. The second goal you'll see is quite relevant to the goals of Ganar. So they're trying to improve the ability of tertiary and workforce development programs to generate workforce skills relevant to a country's development goals. And then three, to provide increased and equitable access to education in crisis and conflict environments. So this is why Ganar is being funded by USAID. However, despite the fact that it's in 16 countries and that there's a lot of positive impressions of this intervention, and it's been shown to be sort of promising or innovative, there's very little rigorous empirical evaluation evidence about its effectiveness. So USAID has a new strategy, a new evaluation policy that represents a new agency focus on monitoring and evaluation, and it's setting aside at least 3% of each operating unit's program funds to do rigorous impact evaluation. So this evaluation, the one that I'm involved in, this impact evaluation of the Ganar program, is one of the first rigorous impact evaluations that USAID has done in this sector. So it's a really exciting opportunity for those who are researchers and who believe in the importance of high-quality, rigorous research to inform policy and practice. So it's a very exciting opportunity. So I became involved in the Ganar Alliance Impact Evaluation in Honduras and Guatemala. I've been doing research in Honduras for about 15 years, actually, on opportunities, transformative educational opportunities for adolescents. Primarily, my research experience prior to this had been working in rural areas. Ganar targets urban areas, but my understanding of opportunities for youth and of the needs of this population made me excited to work on this impact evaluation. USAID has subcontracted a social science research firm called Social Impact, which is based outside of Washington, D.C. And then they have entered into a sub-agreement with UC Berkeley and with myself to do one component of this impact evaluation. So it's also a really exciting opportunity to be doing work with USAID and with a small business in the DC area. So I want to say a little bit more about why Honduras and Guatemala. So I've given a little bit of background about the intervention itself, but as Professor Shaken was saying, Honduras is a really important country to be trying to engage with and to try to better understand the dynamics that are going on there, such that we can have a better understanding of what's happened, in the United States in terms of receiving a number of unaccompanied minors and families, mothers and children, last summer. And so I'm sure many of you know that there are an estimated 70,000 gang members in Central America, but I actually saw another statistic that made me think this was a typo. The most recent statistic I've seen is that there are 700,000 gang members in Central America, with the majority living in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. So one of the main reasons why we see this increase in gang activity is because of the narco-trafficking industry. That tends to rely on gangs as a way that it operates. So this is also Honduras. Until very recently, I think Honduras and El Salvador just swapped for this unfortunate statistic of having the highest homicide rates in the world. So you can see here the countries in dark red at the top. Honduras and El Salvador have between 60 and 69 homicides per 100,000 people in the population. So these are very, very high rates and very unfortunate, which just also testify to the very high amount of violence that we see in these countries. And then in terms of education, so we know that these are contexts that are characterized by very high levels of violence. But in Latin America and the Caribbean, more than 20 million people of secondary school age are either not enrolled or are lagging behind in school. So we know that there are few educational opportunities for youth in Honduras and in Guatemala to continue in secondary school. And this has resulted in a phenomenon that's called the Nini. So it's jóvenes que ni están trabajando ni están estudiando. So the ninis. And this is some statistics from the Latino Barometro in 2011. So these numbers may be slightly out of date, but that shows the percentage of youth who are not working or studying per country in the region. So you see Honduras is right at the top. Guatemala is around the middle. And so this is a really important issue. This I thought was a really interesting graphic. This came out in a newspaper in Peru. And it's very interesting just to see the image and to reflect on the image too of what the social perception of these ninis are, is that they're like delinquents. That has not been my experience at all. In fact, the youth that I encounter, yes, sometimes they talk about vicios or vices that youth may have a tendency towards, but mostly they describe themselves as being incredibly motivated, very driven, but also very stuck, that they don't have the opportunities because economically they can't find work. There's not very many opportunities for them because they've only finished, say, their primary school. They don't have the money to go back to school because they're working, but they're often working very informally. So sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Often it's just day labor when someone has extra manual labor that they can engage in. And for girls, it's often unpaid labor. So taking care of younger children, helping out with their moms or their dads' work. So the Nini issue is, I think, something that is really important for this population and something that policies and programs need to address. And then, of course, we know that these are two countries that are characterized by very high levels of poverty and inequality. So these are just some basic statistics of life expectancy, infant mortality rate, adult literacy rates, population, and then the GDP per capita. So you can see Honduras in the light yellow and Guatemala, are amongst the countries in the region, with the lowest levels of GDP per capita. And in the case of Guatemala in particular, very, very high rates of inequality. And so this is the sort of social context in which this program is hoping to arrive and to have a significant impact. And so this is essentially the theory of change. This is what the program itself hopes that they are able to do and to accomplish. There's, as I mentioned, these 3 phases of the program, the life skills and job training, the technical training, and then the practical experience here in phase 3. And they're hoping that through this, the youth will gain employability and life skills, technical skills, work experience, and relationships that will ultimately lead to these primary outcomes. There's kind of 3 key goals of the program: employment, entrepreneurship, or that youth re-enter school. And then the secondary outcomes that they're interested in are that the program will change gender roles and perceptions and improve the security of the communities. What I'm interested in as a researcher is not just does the program accomplish these goals or doesn't it, but how. So what's happening in here? What are the processes by which, the transformational processes that we can gain some understanding and insights of through this evaluation and through this study? And so the theoretical frameworks that I'm bringing to this work as a scholar in education and as someone who's interested in understanding transformational educational experiences are primarily 4. The first one is the kind of broadest, which is the capabilities approach, which is a framework for human well-being that was developed by the economist Amartya Sen and the philosopher Martha Nussbaum. And they essentially propose an alternative to understanding well-being from the approach that's traditionally thought of as a human capital approach. So not just looking at GDP per capita, the statistics I just showed you, but trying to better understand quality of life issues. And Martha Nussbaum proposes 10 basic human capabilities that she believes should be the sort of framework for understanding whether people have lives that they have reason to value. And so some of these capabilities are very relevant to the work that Ganar is doing, one of which is actually play. So within this framework, there's this idea that people should have opportunities to play and to have recreational opportunities. And I was really surprised in doing this research that boys and adolescent males have the opportunity to play. But girls don't have very many opportunities to play once they get to be adolescents. They're really seen as kind of young adults or as adults. Many of them even start to have children, and they're not going on Sunday afternoon to play football or soccer with their friends. And so I think thinking about these as kind of opportunities that all people should have in order to lead dignified lives, and to think about play and some of the other capabilities that Nussbaum is proposing really help us to frame this intervention in a way that speaks to broader questions around what is development, what does it look like, and how can education trigger the development process. The second is the work of Jim Heckman, who is an economist who is very influential for his work regarding the investment in early childhood education. And the other area of research that he's well known for is understanding the ways in which character skills predict life outcomes. So one of his arguments is that it's not just the technical knowledge and the skills that people have, but it's character skills such as conscientiousness, work ethic, ability to communicate in groups. So he brings in actually literature from psychology and looking at personality traits to better understand how these skills predict success in the labor market. And then he argues that we actually need programs and policies that build these skills. So he argues that these are not skills that are predetermined, but can be fostered and can be developed through educational experiences. And this, I think, is quite relevant for the experience of Ganar. The third theoretical framework that I'm bringing in is that around violence and the construction of masculinity in Latin America. Some work that has come from the region, primarily looking at gang involvement in Colombia. in the early 2000s, a scholar named Adam Baird has looked at how young men in sort of creating their identities as adult males had the opportunity to either reject or embrace gang culture. And one of the things that he argues is that for some males, there are very few alternatives in finding a sense of social belonging other than becoming involved in the gang. And so this is really helpful for me in trying to understand how Ganar can change gender roles and gender understandings. And then, of course, there's this fourth body of literature, which is around sports for development. So Ganar is one of many programs that, we have UNICEF programs and programs in the Middle East and programs around the world that are promoting sport for peace or sports for development. And this idea that sports is going to be this kind of trigger or catalyst for change. And so there's a rich literature on this, which is also potentially going to help us understand sort of why sport can have the effects that it does. So these are the sort of lingering frameworks that are going to help me make sense of the findings that we have. And I should say now that we're in a very early stage of the research. The study's been going on now for about 4 years, but we have a cohort approach. And so we've only been able to collect data, but we haven't yet had enough students go through the program to be able to fully analyze the results. So what I'm presenting today is quite preliminary. But there are two key questions that inform this study. The first is a proof of concept, and that's what really USAID is interested in knowing. So to what extent does participation and completion of the Ganar program increase the likelihood that youth will obtain and maintain jobs, return to school, start their own business, or reduce risky behavior? And then the second question that they're interested in is to better understand the use of sport. So does the use of sport in Ganar increase the retention rate, job insertion rate, and effectiveness of the program to teach life skills, language, math, IT, and other complementary activities? Because USAID has been investing in sports for development programs, and so it's hoping to learn something about this specific approach. Is there something magical about sports? So, we all, they think yes. Ganar is really convinced that the sports is really what is holding this together in a way that makes it very appealing to youth, that makes it very appealing to donors, that makes it very appealing in these communities. And so we want to know, like, if we were to substitute sports with orchestra, or sports with gardening, or sports with something else that maybe people feel drawn to, would it have the same effects? I'm interested in another set of questions which are more theoretical in nature. So I'm interested in knowing the effects of the program, but I'm also hoping this will be an opportunity for me to speak to some lingering questions around in what ways, if any, does participation in Ganar contribute to the regeneration of the social fabric of the communities in which it operates? So one of the main consequences of the increased levels of violence in these communities is the deterioration of the social fabric, that people are afraid to go outside, people are afraid to go on public transportation. Many people don't have the same kind of relationships with their neighbors as they did in the past. And so I'm really interested in how this can serve as an opportunity to regenerate the social fabric. What are the processes by which this regeneration occurs? What is the role of sport and play in sparking personal transformation and improving relationships? And in particular, how does the use of sport enable individuals to trust one another? So we think about trust as a sort of foundation of building social capital. What's happening here, and how does this help us to better understand that process? And then how, if at all, do social norms around gender change? So these are the kind of questions that brought me to the study, and that I'm looking forward to having an opportunity to fully explore. So Ganar started in these two new countries, Honduras in San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa, and then in Guatemala City and Villanueva. And we have a randomized control trial design. So in Honduras, you can see that we have in the sample 1,300 youth, 650 which have been assigned to the Ganar program, and 650 which have been assigned to a control group. The research design is similar in Guatemala, but I'm going to skip that because it would take me about 20 minutes to explain. So if anyone's really interested in research design, let me know, but I want to move through to some of our preliminary findings and then have a discussion with you. So in both sites, in both studies, both Guatemala and Honduras, there are 3 cohorts, as I've mentioned. There's a pilot cohort and then 2 evaluation cohorts. As I mentioned, the youth are randomly assigned into groups, the treatment and control. In Guatemala, we had a comparison. And then we're following up with the youth at 3 points in time. So the first time is at baseline, when they first start the program, or 0 months. The second time is at 9 months, when they've just finished the program. And the data that I'm sharing today are from that time period. So I have about 55 interviews that I've analyzed from youth when they finished at 9 months. And then, really exciting, we have a long-term follow-up at 27 months. This is really unique for job training types of programs. Many do a sort of round of data collection right after, or immediately after the program. We want to know sort of what happens in the long term. So even if these kids do get jobs, if these adolescents do get jobs, are they then getting better jobs? Or, you know, are they getting a job temporarily and then the nature of the labor market is such that they aren't able to hang on to those jobs? So this is, to me, very exciting, and we don't have any of that data yet, unfortunately. So you'll have to stay tuned. Maybe next year I'll come back in part 2, tell you about those findings. So it's a mixed method study, both quantitative and qualitative. In our quantitative measures, the outcomes we're most interested in are these 3 final outcomes of do they get a job, or have they started their own business of some sort, or have they restarted school. The intermediate outcomes that we're thinking will lead to this include self-esteem, self-discipline, outlook, planning for the future, community participation, their technical skills. And we're using this really interesting measure called Development Assets Profile, which is particularly designed to look at youth and adolescent development. And then we also use a Rosenberg scale, which is this pretty classic model of measure of self-esteem. And then we also are looking at these secondary outcomes through a measure that's called a gender equitable index, modified version of that. And then we're also looking at risky behavior using randomized response and questions about peers to get at any gang activity, drug use, alcohol use, unprotected sex, etc. And then for the qualitative, which is the component of the study that I'm leading, the purpose of this is really to supplement and triangulate the quantitative, to identify any unintended effects, to more comprehensively capture the difficult to measure concepts and processes, exploring mechanisms and obstacles to change, and then probing the value added of sports. So in each country, we have 12 longitudinal multi-perspective case studies. So these are really in-depth case studies where we're trying to understand who is this youth, what has been their experience by interviewing the youth over these 3 points in time, someone in the youth's family, and then someone else who the youth comes into contact with through the program. So the facilitator, the technical trainer, the internship supervisor. If we can interview their employer, we interview their employer. So it's a really interesting and rich and deep case study of 12 youth. Then we're doing 50 exit interviews at with each cohort. And so we'll have a number of very short, targeted, more structured qualitative interviews, but that are still, I think, yielding very rich data. Those last, and those are the data that I'll be sharing today. To analyze the data, we are first digitally recording, and then transcribing. We're both using inductive and deductive coding. So we have some codes that we've developed that are based on the themes that Ganar is trying to accomplish, and then we create new codes through the process of reading the transcripts and better understanding some of the patterns. We're using Deduce, which is a qualitative data analysis software, which also has the opportunity to do mixed methods analysis, which we're really excited about. We haven't done it yet, but we're hoping to. Okay, so the findings. So essentially, and again, this is preliminary and coming from these exit interviews, but youth are consistently describing social benefits from participation in the program, including having new friends and wider social circles. They stress life skills, including conscientiousness, emotional stability, extroversion, and agreeableness, and these are all commonly mentioned as program benefits. The use of sports facilitates students' understanding and application of these skills, in particular through the metaphor of the team. And program facilitators receive rave reviews from participants are a key reason why the program went smoothly and youth enjoy their experience. However, at the time that we conducted this round of data collection, very few youth reported gaining employment through their participation in Ganar. Because this was the first follow-up, it's possible that not enough time had elapsed for the youth to find job. So these are essentially, I think, what the findings that USAID might be interested in knowing from this data analysis. But I want to go a little bit further in the analysis and try to understand some of those question marks that you saw in the theory of change And in particular, what we're finding is that it's the combination of communication, trust, friendship, and extroversion that's allowing youth to learn to work together as a team. And that's through this experience that they're learning the importance of teamwork. And they can apply this in other contexts, particularly the locations where they conducted their internships. Youth also develop a greater conscientiousness, including a deeper sense of commitment, achievement striving, improved work ethic, discipline, persistence, and respect for others. This helps them feel unstuck. So the youth are often using this word estancada, which always makes me think of like being stuck in the mud, like really being, not being able to move. And so they talk about how Ganar helps them to feel unstuck, or ya no estoy estancada. So in doing the analysis, I just wanted to show you essentially like what are some of the themes, because these sound like quite strong findings. I was actually shocked when I started looking at the interview data of how consistent these themes were. So this is just a count of some of the codes that we applied to the data and some of these themes. So you can see we started off with this just early unsolicited mention of sports. So immediately the youth start talking about sports, which helps us get at this question of the value added of sports. And then we have some of these impact of the program codes with academic benefits, very few, employment, you see some, gender perceptions, but then when you get to life skills and social relations, you see that these are the two with 156 and 149 counts that are coming up over and over again in the interviews, and then values also being very important. So we had to actually break this down even further into a second level with life skills and employability and social relations. So where we see these themes coming up over and over again of conscientiousness, agreeableness, emotional stability, extroversion, mixed, and then these concrete mentions of specific skills such as interview skills or CV preparation. And then with social relations, we see extroversion, importance of play, the group as a team, agreeableness, new friends. What's very difficult for me is that these are so co-tangled that it's actually very difficult to disentangle them because they all build on each other. Yes?
Are these number of people?
No. So these are actually, I have this note here. So each interview segment mentioned a theme was coded, meaning that the same code could appear multiple times in an interview and that segments of text could be tagged by more than one code. So it's kind of, you can't really like calculate a percentage or something. So there were 50 exit interviews, and this was in some ways across all of those 50 interviews, how many times those themes came up. So often in one sentence even, 6 different themes could come up because, as I say, these are so interrelated. So I actually brought some data with me today, and we probably don't actually, in fact, we don't have time to go through it all, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. But this is some interview excerpts that talk about these 4 key themes: communication and trust through play, learning to work as a team, improving the social fabric, and job-related character skills. So you can see and read some of the data from these. It's in English, it's been translated to English, but I also kept the original Spanish. The original Spanish is not as nicely formatted as the English because it's now listed as a footnote. But for those of you who would like to read in either language, you'll see it here. And based on some of these themes. So, just to read one to you, in the first with Jose, nice to meet you, Jose. I'd like to talk to you more about your experiences with Ganar. For example, what did you like most about the program and why? He says, primarily the unity that they talked about, uniting as a team, mainly also the games that we also played, pairing up with classmates, and the work in groups was excellent. Is there anything else you want to add? No, mainly that I hope that they continue to provide opportunities to youth, because this is a value that needs to be appreciated in youth. They are the fruit, so that society keeps growing more and more. So I think what we're seeing essentially, in a nutshell, the kind of argument that's beginning to emerge is that this emphasis on play and communication and social relations is leading to personal changes. So it's leading to these job-related character skills, to this feeling of being unstuck. The question is, will it lead to jobs given the structural constraints of the environment? And so the next steps obviously are to continue to do data collection and analysis at the long-term follow-up and to explore how the constraints of the environment may prevent Ganar from reaching its goals. What are realistic expectations given the structural inequality and lack of job opportunities? So I'm sorry that we didn't have time to go through all of this data, but You can, read it, and I'd love to hear your feedback. We are at 4:46, so I want to make sure we save about 15 minutes for conversation, for any thoughts that you have, any questions that you might have. And if there aren't questions, then I can share my favorite quotes with you. But for now, I'll just say thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. This is my email address, my contact information. I have an office in Tolman Hall. I'd be delighted to hear from any of you or any of you in our virtual audience. And I'll end there. Thank you. And maybe tell me who you are. I know some of you, but I don't know the two of you. I'd love to hear sort of where you are coming from and what you're studying, if you're studying.
I'm Sarah Reynolds. I'm a researcher in the School of Public Health.
Ah, great. Excellent.
My name's Jackie. I work here at the Center for Latin American Studies. And actually, I did research many years ago in Brazil on a program like this. It was Luta pela Paz, which is like an early on fight for peace.
Great.
And development
Excellent.
in sports.
Wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Any questions, comments?
I have a quick question. Ganar, was that an independent program or was it initiated by USAID?
Yeah, so it was initiated by this organization called Partners of the Americas,
I see.
which is a group of people who, some of them used to work for USAID, some of them were Peace Corps volunteers. So it's an organization that's based in Washington, D.C., has very strong connections to USAID and to U.S. development policy in general. And what's really interesting though about the model is that their sort of hub is Partners in Washington. And then when they start the program in a local context, they look for local organizations that have experience working with youth. And then it's those local organizations that do all of the program execution. So Partners does the training, but they use local groups to actually be the ones who are working with youth and to implement the program. So often these organizations already have some sort of youth programming. Sometimes they're doing the technical training, actually. And so then they're trained to do Ganar as an additional program to their existing work.
And I have actually one very brief comment, which is when you laid out sort of the theoretical issues you were concerned with, I found that absolutely fascinating, the depth and range of these broad issues, and then the ways in which they weave into the study itself and the qualitative dimension of it. So I very much look forward to
It's very
results.
early. It's kind of all, I feel it's a little bit disorganized and maybe too many theories, but for now we'll start broad, and then as the findings come in, we'll continue to refine. So thank you very much. Thank you. Yes,
I'm wondering, where did this take place, or do they create the spaces for this? Do they use in the community, or do they take place in a neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a great question. So where exactly? So basically these NGOs often, or as I say, they already have programming, and sometimes they already have buildings, but so often they need to find a site that has a field or that has some place that the kids can play. And so, for example, in one, it's a community center. And others. So it really varies depending on who the local implementer is. But it's usually in these communities, and they try to find communities where there's enough youth that they can meet the demand, which isn't hard to do. So.
As you arrive at like a decision later on, so like what you're going to recommend to USAID and that sort of thing. So the job part aside, have you looked at any of the results of the psychological measures, and are these triangulating?
Yeah, so we've only looked at the baseline. We haven't yet been able to finish the post-intervention measures. So basically from the baseline, we can tell that the measures are good. Like for example, this development assets profile. It hadn't been used in Honduras before, but it's been used in other countries. And it's a very long measure. Because it's trying to get at, it has sort of this theory around what do adolescents need in order to have sort of healthy adolescent development. And it was a little bit risky for us to include it because it's extremely long. There's like 60 questions. But it actually seems to be working quite well. So, it has good measurement properties. But because we have this cohort model, not all the cohorts have finished. So we have just one cohort that's gone through. The second one finished, but we haven't finished the data analysis from that, so we don't have any way to look and see the program effects. So
and if they're different, or
yeah,
what would you?
What will I recommend?
Or what would you
So
conclude
it's,
about
you know
that
what's really
person?
interesting is that the qualitative findings are so consistent and so strong around some of these, communication, teamwork, respect, all of these character traits. But it still may be very well that they don't get jobs. I mean, I think that the context very well may prevent even youth who are super determined, super motivated. It's really challenging. So I think I personally would say that this is a kind of program that deserves funding, continued funding in the region, given the other issues that I've described of the deteriorated social fabric, of issues related to crime and violence, particularly for adolescent males. The way in which this program is uniquely positioned to reach adolescent males in particular, I think is very compelling. So, some of these, we can look at employment, we can look at going back to school, but then there are other things that are much more difficult to capture quantitatively. And we didn't do a study that would allow us to, kind of look at whether or not, this is preventing violence per se. We can say that it's preventing risky behavior, or that there seems to be a difference between, Ganar participants and the comparison group in terms of risky behavior. But I think, through the qualitative data so far, you could make a compelling case that the program is really addressing the underlying causes of violence and social decay that we're seeing in the urban areas. So
that's a really nice compliment to have the qualitative part to balance out what the quantitative part may not be.
Exactly. That was the intention. So yeah. Any other questions?
I have one question, because the study obviously began before the broad interest on the child migrants from this region. And as you know, Vice President Biden was just in the region talking about a possibility of $1 billion of aid. So clearly this is going to be intersecting, or is intersecting, with the notion of children who have to leave.
Yeah.
Does that show up in any of the interviews?
Yes, because these children are gone.
Yeah.
So what we find, and luckily, because I had done work earlier in Honduras in a longitudinal quantitative study in rural areas, I knew that, for example, youth do have cell phones, but their numbers change all the time, often because they get their cell phones stolen, but that they're on Facebook. And so what we've done is we've actually found that a lot of the youth, I don't know exactly what our response rate is, but we find that some of them have migrated. That they're not in Honduras anymore. They're here. And through Facebook, we're now trying to reach out to them to see if they'll still participate in the study. So I think it's definitely the migration issue is something that's affected us very directly. But I think more generally, it's what you see is the deteriorated security conditions. So, as I said, I've been doing research in Honduras since 1999, and in these communities, what's been very difficult is that people, have to take serious risks just to come to participate in the research. We pay for their transportation, but taking public transportation can be quite risky, and also it's the programs themselves and the program staff and whether they're exposing themselves to risk. So the same kinds of social conditions that have resulted in the high number of unaccompanied youth coming and in women and children fleeing the region because they're being extorted or because they've been threatened with violence. Those are the same kinds of conditions that are confronted, that the participants confront every day. We had one case where we were trying to contact one of the young men in the studies, and we couldn't reach him. We finally we asked also on the survey for them to list the number of someone who will know how to contact them. And when we reached that number, it was the young man's father. He told us that he had been killed. And he was basically, I looked it up and it was in the newspaper, and that he was standing in the corredor de muerte, the death's corridor, and was just killed in a drive-by shooting. So, these are very harsh realities that the youth are living in, very difficult contexts. And so you hope that, when you hear these youth talk about the light that the program brings and the hope that it brings and the feeling of them being unstuck. You hope that it will have long-term effects, not just the short-term effects. And I think the design of our research will help us get at the long-term effects, or also just the policy recommendations of programs like these need to also be coupled with labor force incentive programs to create more jobs for youth, and then other types of reforms. Miguel.
Are you seeing any counter effects on youth motivation because of the lack of job opportunities that they are facing?
Yeah. So I think there's this is the issue of the nini, right? So what we see is that that they do feel like this notion of feeling estancado or feeling stuck because they don't have job opportunities, but they all have very high aspirations for the future. So when you ask them, what do you hope to do, what do you plan to do, they all actually have, I would say, extremely ambitious, given the context, extremely ambitious goals and future plans. So I think it's a sort of positive or optimistic orientation that we see in the youth. I think I've interviewed a few that seem to be unmotivated, and I think some of them talk about being unmotivated in their interviews, and then through the intervention they feel more motivated. I think the trickiest thing is that many of them have only finished schooling up to the 6th grade. So the idea is that also through Ganar they'll maybe take night school or something so they can finish their 9th grade completion. But really one of the best outcomes for these youth will be getting very basic minimum wage employment. Some of them work, there's Grupo Intur, which is a big conglomerate of fast food chains. So they are like Dunkin' Donuts and Popeyes and a number of fast food restaurants that are all over San Pedro Sula and Tegucigalpa. That a really good outcome is to have a job in Pizza Hut or Chili's at the sort of very bottom of the employment scale there. But it's still so much better than what they had previously. So I think what I have found is that the youth are very motivated and they are optimistic, but that again the labor opportunities are pretty limited.
So I was wondering about, you said that the organizations have already existed, that they're using.
Mm-hmm.
So what do the organizations say about, are they just expanding their reach, or are they really excited about adding the sports component? What do they say about
Yeah, they're really excited about the program. They love the program. Sometimes they hire new staff, to do this particular program, and those staff will have an interest in sports. And but yes, that's been the model. So they've looked for organizations that are in communities that have connections with youth, and then these organizations are willing to take on a new program in addition to the portfolio of activities they're already doing. And they love the program. I mean, people love this program. That's why it's so good that we're doing an impact evaluation, because everyone loves it. Everyone thinks it's great. The kids love it, the staff love it, the businesses love it, the president loves it. I went to, I've been now at 2 events where the president comes. People love it, but does it work? We don't know. We'll find out. To be continued. Yeah.
So, are there mentors?
Yeah, so they're trying to find mentors. They're trying to find mentors for the youth, yeah. They use the Rotary Club connections there. Bye, Miguel, thanks for coming. So they use connections through Rotary primarily, which is, US-based organization. So they use Rotarians are often identified as mentors. So, yeah. And it's so fun because when I get to go, I always bring my sneakers and wind up playing. So. Well, thank you so much.
Are the girls playing soccer?
The girls play soccer too. One even was pregnant, and she talked about how you can read her testimony. Yeah, maybe I took it out, but yeah, girls play too. Some of the girls, there was 3 girls of the 50 who complained that it was too hot. And I agree, it's really, really hot in San Pedro Sula. But yeah, the girls really like it. That was one of my thoughts, was how are they going to react to this? But it's been very, very welcome. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.